Silence lies across the plains of southeastern Colorado, a silence filled not with peace, but with memory. The land looks empty now, open sky, tall grass brushing in the wind. But once, this place was alive with families, fires, stories, hopes, and a fragile promise of peace. History often speaks of victories and heroes. But the real weight of history lives in the moments where trust was broken, where voices were ignored, and where choices left wounds that would echo for generations. The story you are about to hear is one of the most painful chapters in the relationship between the United States and Native nations. A chapter built not from war, but from misunderstanding, fear, and broken promises. This is the story behind the Sand Creek Massacre. But before we reach that day, we must understand what led to it. Because tragedies do not appear by surprise. They grow slowly, from tensions that went unresolved, agreements that went unprotected, and people who struggled to survive as the world around them began to change faster than they could comprehend. In the early 1860s, the Great Plains were not empty lands. They were the homelands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho, two nations whose cultures had grown across the plains for generations. They lived through movement, ceremony, and harmony with the land that sustained them. But pressure was coming. Settlers moving west, military forts appearing, new borders drawn by distant governments, old agreements replaced by new ones, food sources shrinking, and tensions rising. Yet even in the midst of uncertainty, there were leaders who sought peace above all. One of them was Black Kettle, a respected Cheyenne chief whose voice carried calm, reason, and a relentless hope that coexistence was still possible. He traveled far to meet government officials. He listened. He negotiated. He asked only for safety, for his people, for their families, for their right to live without fear. And after long talks, he was told something clear. If the Cheyenne and Arapaho moved to a designated area along Sand Creek, raised a white flag and an American flag, and avoided conflict, then they would be protected. Black Kettle believed in that promise. He believed that peace, once agreed to, would be honored. And so, following the instructions of the U.S. government, he led his people to Sand Creek, a quiet stretch of land far from conflict, far from soldiers, far from the rising tensions in the territory. Families set up their lodges. Children played in the dust. Elders warmed themselves near the fires. Women prepared food, believing, perhaps for the first time in years, that safety was finally near. At the center of the village flew two symbols: a white flag of truce, and above it, the flag of the United States. To Black Kettle, this meant something deeply sacred, a promise kept. But promises are only as strong as those who protect them. And far away, beyond the quiet banks of Sand Creek, forces were moving, decisions being made, based on fear, rumors, misinformation, and a growing hunger for control of the territory. While the Cheyenne and Arapaho slept under the cold November sky, believing they were under protection, others believed a different story, a story that would soon collide with their peaceful village. A tragic decision was approaching, one that would turn Sand Creek into one of the most sorrowful memories in American history. The wind on the plains carries many stories, but few are as important to remember as the story of what happened next. Because history is not only about the past, it is about what we choose to understand and what we choose never to repeat. The winter of 1864 crept slowly across the plains, cold winds sweeping through tall grass, carrying whispers of uncertainty. To the Cheyenne and Arapaho families at Sand Creek, the days felt quiet, almost peaceful. Children ran along the creek bed, their laughter echoing across the open valley. Women stitched clothing, prepared food, and tried to rebuild a sense of normal life. Black Kettle remained hopeful. He trusted the promises made to him. He believed that peace, if honored by both sides, could endure. But beyond the horizon, the world was changing in ways the village could not see. The Civil War was raging far to the east. News traveled slowly, but its effects rippled across the plains. Many U.S. soldiers were withdrawn to fight in the war, and in their place came volunteer regiments. Men often driven more by fear, rumor, or ambition than by discipline or understanding. The Colorado Territory, young and uncertain, was filled with worry about its future. Settlers feared raids, leaders feared rebellion, and many military officers felt they were under pressure to control the frontier. One of these officers was Colonel John Chivington, a man whose beliefs, fears, and political ambitions would soon collide with the peaceful camp at Sand Creek. Chivington saw the world differently than Black Kettle. Where Black Kettle saw negotiation, Chivington saw danger. Where Black Kettle saw coexistence, Chivington believed force was necessary. He became convinced, without proof, that tribes gathering on the plains might be preparing for violence. In truth, Black Kettle was preparing for winter and hoping for peace. But rumors spread faster than truth. Stories, mostly unverified, moved between camps. Reports of raids, attacks on travelers, movements seen from a distance, shadows mistaken for threats. In tense times, fear can turn shadows into enemies. And in this atmosphere of fear, promises made by one part of the U.S. government were overshadowed by decisions made by others. Messages were lost. Orders were unclear. What one official promised, another doubted. Even within the military, there was no agreement on who was peaceful and who was hostile. Yet Black Kettle still believed the agreement stood firm. He still raised the white flag and the American flag daily. Symbols of trust. Symbols of a promise he believed was mutual. Meanwhile, Chivington met with territorial leaders who urged him to take action, to show force, to secure the frontier. Some believed that striking hard, striking fast, would strengthen their political position during wartime. No one in these meetings asked the most important question: what if the people at Sand Creek truly believed they were safe? Distance created misunderstanding. Misunderstanding created fear. Fear created a decision, one that would lead the volunteer regiment toward the peaceful camp. Before dawn on November 29th, while the village slept, Chivington and his men marched silently across the plains, their boots crunching frost, their breaths fogging in the cold air, their horses uneasy beneath them. They approached the camp long before sunrise, moving through darkness, toward a village that expected protection, not conflict. The people at Sand Creek had no idea that soldiers were coming. There were no scouts sent to warn them, no messages delivered, no negotiations attempted, just movement in the night, riding toward an unimaginable outcome. As dawn approached, the first weak light touched the horizon. In the village, mothers stirred awake. Fires began to crackle. Children stretched beneath blankets. Black Kettle stepped outside his lodge and saw the flags still flying, symbols he believed would keep them safe. But on the distant ridge, shadows began to gather. Shapes, movement, dozens, then hundreds. The quiet of morning was ending, and the long-feared misunderstanding was moments away from turning into tragedy. History often turns on a single decision. This morning was one of those moments. A peaceful village, a trusting leader, and a nation divided by fear, all converging in a single instant. The people of Sand Creek still believed. The promise of protection held true, but the regiment riding toward them believed something entirely different. And the gap between those two beliefs was about to create one of the most sorrowful chapters ever written on these plains. The sun had not yet risen, but the sky held the quiet glow of a world preparing for morning. Sand Creek lay still, its surface reflecting the pale hints of dawn. Inside the village, people stirred gently, unaware that the calmness they felt was the last they would know for a very long time. Black Kettle woke early, as he always did. He stepped outside his lodge, taking in the cold air, watching the sky shift from deep blue to silver. He looked at the flags, the white flag for peace, the American flag above it, and felt a fragile sense of hope settle over him. For weeks, he had believed in the promise of safety. He had spoken those words to his people, told them the government assured protection if they stayed at Sand Creek, and kept to the agreements made. But far beyond the village, the choices of others were already moving toward them. Colonel Chivington and his men approached in silence, the frosted grass crunching beneath hooves and boots. Some soldiers shivered from the cold, others from nerves, and others from uncertainty. For even within the ranks, not every man agreed with what they were riding toward. Some had heard the village was peaceful. Some believed the flags meant safety. Others questioned the intelligence reports that claimed a hostile camp was nearby. But none of them spoke loudly enough to change the decision. The march continued. Back at Sand Creek, women sparked early morning fires, sending thin ribbons of smoke into the quiet air. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes, still wrapped in warmth. Elders murmured soft morning prayers. Horses snorted, their breath forming pale clouds in the dim light. Life was moving gently, unaware of the shadow approaching. In the distance, so faint that only those paying close attention might notice, a cluster of dark forms appeared along the ridge. They were still too far to identify, still too distant for alarm, still shaped more like shadows than men. A young Cheyenne boy, fetching water from the creek, paused for a moment and squinted up toward the ridge. He saw the faint movement but did not understand it. He believed it was travelers, or perhaps a hunting party returning early. He turned back toward the village. Black Kettle continued his morning routine, speaking quietly with his wife, checking on the condition of the lodges, and ensuring the flags were secure in the breeze. He had done everything asked of him, every instruction followed, every promise honored. If there was one man on those plains who believed peace was still within reach, it was him. But peace depends not only on those who want it, but also on those who guard it. And somewhere between the promises made at treaty talks and the decisions made inside military tents, the line between peace and conflict had been severed. Messages written on paper had traveled slower than the fears carried by rumor. Agreements made in calm meetings were overshadowed by decisions made in moments of pressure. The truth was simple yet painful. The village believed it was safe. Those approaching it did not believe the same story. And in this difference, this gap in understanding, tragedy took shape. The sun climbed a little higher, bringing gold to the horizon. Birds stirred. The surface of Sand Creek shimmered with early light. Black Kettle stood near the flags and looked over his people, his heart steady and hopeful. He had no reason to fear. No warning had reached him. No message of danger had been delivered. No voice told him to move. Behind him, the village breathed with the rhythm of ordinary life. But just beyond the ridge, the soldiers slowed their march. Chivington raised his hand, signaling them to halt. The men repositioned themselves, forming lines, gathering in silence, their faces tense in the cold light. They could see the flags in the village now. They could see the lodges, the fires, the people beginning their day. Still, the decision had already been made. The moment between peace and tragedy was narrowing. The light of dawn touched the plains, revealing two worlds, one waking in innocence, the other preparing for action. History often remembers events, but what happened at Sand Creek was shaped long before the first command was given. It was shaped in confusion, in fear, in misunderstanding, and in the fragile hope of a leader who believed in promises that others failed to protect. As the sun finally broke over the horizon, the world held its breath. The ridge darkened with silhouettes. The village glowed with morning warmth, and the space between the two was about to disappear. The ridge was quiet, but the silence felt heavier now, as if the land itself sensed a shift that the people below could not yet see. Morning light crept slowly across the plains, pulling the shadows back, revealing more of what waited just beyond sight. In the village, the morning routines continued. Mothers carried water. Children chased each other around the lodges. Elders spoke softly, welcoming the warmth of a new day. Nothing in the air hinted at danger. Nothing felt unusual. Life followed its familiar rhythm. Black Kettle walked through the village, greeting families, checking on the fires, offering reassuring words. As any leader would, he was calm, steady, believing deeply in the promise given to him. Meanwhile, Chivington surveyed the village from the ridge. He saw the smoke rising gently. He saw no weapons drawn. He saw families moving peacefully. But he had already made his decision. And once a decision is set in motion, turning back is not always easy. Some soldiers hesitated. They whispered among themselves. They questioned whether this was the right village, the right people, the right moment. But orders were orders, and uncertainty was buried beneath discipline. The rising sun revealed more of the valley. The creek shimmered faintly. The lodges glowed in soft gold. It was a peaceful sight, a sight that told one story to the people who lived there, and a different story to the men approaching from the ridge. Down in the village, a young mother stepped outside her lodge, shielding her eyes from the growing sunlight. She noticed birds scattering suddenly, lifting sharply into the sky. She wondered why, but only for a moment. Then she returned to her work. Black Kettle inspected the flags again, ensuring they were clearly visible. The white flag for peace, the American flag above it. To him, these symbols meant protection, a reminder that agreements still mattered. But on the ridge, many soldiers were too far away to see the flags clearly. Some squinted, some debated what they saw, some only saw movement in the valley and assumed it meant something else. Misinterpretation, the most dangerous spark of all. A soft wind brushed across the grass, carrying a stillness that felt almost unnatural. Moments like this often come before decisions that cannot be undone. Chivington rode along the line of soldiers, his horse stepping carefully across the ridge. He spoke quietly, his voice firm, his intentions clear. The men adjusted their positions and prepared to advance. Below, a group of children gathered at the creek, tossing pebbles into the water, laughing as the ripples spread outward. Their laughter drifted softly, reaching no one on the ridge, or perhaps reaching those who chose not to hear it. Elders sat together near the center of the village, warming themselves at a fire, discussing the coming winter, planning hunts, thinking of ordinary things, ordinary moments. Unaware of what was approaching, Black Kettle spoke with a young man about preparations for the cold season. He reminded him to gather wood, to help the elders, to take care of the children. A leader thinking of his people's needs, not imagining danger was near. Chivington lifted his hand again. A signal. The soldiers shifted, their movements controlled, their faces tightened with tension. The moment was closing in. On the plains, the wind dropped suddenly. The air felt heavier. A long, quiet pause settled between both worlds. A pause filled with meaning invisible to those living it. The village dogs pricked their ears, sensing something that humans could not. They stared toward the ridge, silent and alert. Animals often know what people overlook. A faint metallic sound rang across the plains, a sound too soft for most to notice, but sharp enough for those listening carefully. Even the creek seemed to quiet itself, as if waiting. From the ridge, the village looked peaceful, so peaceful it created doubt in the minds of a few soldiers. But doubt without action cannot stop momentum. Between the ridge and Sand Creek lay the final breath of stillness. Two worlds, one innocent, one convinced of danger, were now aligned on a single path. History was seconds away from changing. The moment had come. On the ridge, Chivington lowered his hand. A final signal, a silent command. The soldiers tensed, gripping reins, adjusting positions. The air grew sharp, the kind of sharpness that arrives only when a decision becomes unstoppable. Below, in the village, Black Kettle still stood near the flags. He breathed in the quiet of morning, unaware that eyes watched him from the ridge. His wife approached him, asking about the day ahead, speaking with the gentle calm of someone who believed their world was safe. Elders continued their conversations. Children played near the creek. Women prepared warm food for breakfast. Nothing in the village reflected danger. Nothing suggested panic. Nothing hinted that shadows on the ridge were anything more than distant travelers. But Chivington's men could now see movement clearly. People walking, fires burning, lodges standing peacefully. To some soldiers, the sight deepened their doubt. To others, it hardened their assumptions. Misinterpretation can look like certainty when fear guides the eyes. A young soldier near the front hesitated. He whispered to another man beside him. They don't look hostile, but whispers lack power when commands are louder. No one stepped forward to challenge the order. The sun grew stronger, casting long shadows across the plains. The village glowed warmly. The ridge darkened with soldiers preparing to descend. Two scenes, one peaceful, one poised, both sharing the same morning light, yet held apart by belief. Down below, a small group of children noticed shapes on the ridge. They squinted, confused, wondering who might be arriving so early. One child raised a hand to shield his eyes, then shrugged, thinking little of it. A soft breeze carried faint echoes across the valley. Voices from the ridge, metal shifting, horses stepping. But from the village, the sounds were too distant to form meaning. Life went on. Black Kettle walked toward the center of the village. He spoke to a group of young men about gathering supplies for the cold days ahead. His tone was calm, steady, full of the quiet confidence of a man who believed peace had been secured. On the ridge, soldiers repositioned themselves once more. A few exchanged uneasy glances. Some tightened their grips. Some swallowed hard. Even among them, the truth was unclear, but the path forward had already been set. The horses pawed at the ground, each breath visible in the cold air. They sensed urgency, tension, an energy unfamiliar to their usual morning routines. Animals feel decisions. before humans voiced them. A sudden gust of wind swept across the plains, lifting dust, carrying it between the ridge and the village. For a brief moment, the world blurred, ridge and valley connected by a veil of drifting earth. The dust began to settle. The ridge became clear again. The line of soldiers became unmistakable. And though the villagers did not yet understand, the shapes were no longer shadows. They were men, organized, positioned, waiting for one final order. Black Kettle turned his head slightly. Something in the air felt different. He looked toward the ridge, but the rising light made it difficult to see clearly. Still, no alarm rose within him. The flags were flying. The promises had been given. He believed they were protected. At the ridge, Chivington's face hardened. He looked at the village below, his expression unreadable to his men. Then he shifted his posture, a movement small enough to miss, but clear enough to signal readiness. The soldiers straightened. Their grips tightened. Their horses stirred uneasily. The air felt heavier, like a moment stretching too far, holding too much. Down in the valley, a young woman stepped out of her lodge, carrying a bowl of water. She froze for a brief second, noticing movement on the ridge, but unable to make sense of it. She blinked, then continued with her mourning. The world stood suspended, ridge and village separated by silence and rising light. Two realities, two beliefs, two interpretations of the same landscape. In that silence, choices made far away, in offices, in meetings, in whispered conversations, were about to reshape the lives of everyone at Sand Creek. The ridge darkened with soldiers ready to advance. The village shimmered warmly in the morning glow, and history, quiet and unseen, leaned forward into the moment. Everything was about to change. The first rays of sunlight spread slowly across the plains, lighting the grass, warming the cold earth, and revealing the quiet beauty of the morning. But this beauty stood in contrast to the tension gathering on the ridge. In the village, people continued their morning routines. Smoke lifted from cooking fires. Women prepared food. Children finished their chores. Elders spoke of the coming winter. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt threatening. The day seemed like any other. Black Kettle moved calmly among his people. His presence brought comfort, steadiness, a reminder that peace still held its place. He carried no fear, only determination, to guide his people into the safety he believed had been promised. But on the ridge, Chivington continued organizing his men. He surveyed the village once more. Fires burning, families gathered. No sign of preparation for conflict. Yet his interpretation remained unchanged. A lieutenant rode closer to Chivington, hesitated, then spoke softly. "Sir, are we certain this is the right camp?" A moment of silence followed. Chivington did not answer directly. His expression remained fixed, his mind set. In the village, a group of young men prepared horses for the day. They spoke casually, of hunting, of gathering wood, of tasks that lay ahead. None of their words carried fear. Nearby, a group of children played with sticks, drawing shapes in the soft dirt. Their voices filled the air with light laughter, a sound that floated gently across the open valley. This was the innocence of a morning that believed itself safe. On the ridge, soldiers exchanged glances. Some felt uncertainty tightening in their chests. Others looked toward their officers, seeking reassurance that never came. Still, the formation held. Black Kettle paused near the creek, watching the water move slowly downstream, reflecting the brightening sky. To him, this land felt peaceful, a temporary home, but one marked by hope. A sharp cry from a hawk echoed overhead. It circled once, twice, then flew toward the ridge, before disappearing behind the rising sun. The sound carried longer than expected, as if warning of something unseen. On the ridge, a soldier's horse stamped nervously, hooves carving lines in the cold ground. Its restlessness spread to nearby horses. One by one, animals sensed tension. Their riders tried to ignore. In the valley, a soft hum of morning activity grew. Voices rose and fell like gentle waves. Natural and calm, Black Kettle watched his people with quiet pride, grateful for every moment of peace. After seasons filled with fear, but along the ridge, Chivington's men shifted again, forming a tighter line. A subtle readiness spread through the ranks, a readiness shaped not by clarity, but by pressure. The sun rose higher, pulling the world fully into daylight. The village brightened, its colors deepening, the reds of blankets, the browns of lodges, the silver glints of morning frost melting from the creek. Everything appeared peaceful, too peaceful, some soldiers thought. A Cheyenne elder stepped outside his lodge and studied the ridge thoughtfully. His eyes narrowed. He sensed something unusual, a disturbance in the stillness. But the village had seen travelers before. There was no immediate alarm. A faint metallic clink carried faintly across the plains. A sound of shifting gear, barely audible, barely enough to draw notice. The elder lifted his head slightly, listened, but heard nothing more. The soldiers now sat poised, waiting. Some gripped reins tightly, others inhaled slowly, preparing for the order they expected. A long, fragile moment stretched over the ridge. Below, Black Kettle stepped toward the flags once more. He adjusted them carefully, making sure they were visible, making sure they reminded anyone watching that this was a peaceful camp. He believed the symbols would speak, louder than fear. The plain between ridge and valley felt impossibly quiet. Two worlds, one hopeful, one fearful, had now reached the edge of a single decision, and the boundary between them was seconds from breaking. The morning brightened, casting long stripes of gold across the plains. Light touched the tops of the lodges, the surface of the creek, and the distant ridge, where hundreds of silent shapes waited. A stillness settled over the land, a stillness filled with meaning. In the village, a few people began to notice the unusual presence on the ridge. Not clearly, not enough to alarm them, but enough to pause and look again. Yet nothing seemed threatening enough to break morning routine. The flags were flying. That meant safety. A small group of children pointed toward the ridge, wondering aloud who might be coming. They assumed it was travelers, or perhaps messengers. Something ordinary, something harmless. Their innocence shielded them from suspicion. Black Kettle stepped away from the flags and walked a few paces toward the center of the village. He spoke calmly with several families, assuring them that winter preparations were moving well. His voice carried hope, a hope he believed was shared by the people who promised protection. On the ridge, Chivington rode to the front of the formation. He glanced at the men behind him, some resolute, some conflicted, all waiting for direction. The landscape before them looked peaceful, too peaceful for war, yet they were not there to interpret peace. A soldier near the center line tightened his grip on his reins. He wasn't sure why his chest felt heavy, but he could not shake the feeling that something about this morning was wrong. He looked down at the village, a scene that did not match the stories they had heard. Meanwhile, in the camp, a Cheyenne woman returned from the creek with a bucket of fresh water. She stopped briefly, glanced toward the ridge, noticed the faint movement, but still felt no fear. Flags meant safety. Flags meant promises. A soft breeze stirred, lifting dust and carrying it across the plains. For a moment, the dust created a thin veil between ridge and village, a brief curtain across a story that was nearing its turning point. A group of young warriors, though peaceful and compliant with government orders, noticed something unusual. They saw horses. They saw the outline of men, but they also saw the flags and believed the flags would protect them. Black Kettle turned again to look toward the ridge. He shaded his eyes with his hand. He could see the faint shapes now, but the distance made interpretation difficult. Still, no message had arrived. No warning had been given. No reason existed to believe danger was near. On the ridge, soldiers shifted uneasily. A lieutenant approached Chivington once more, hesitating before speaking. "Sir, they look peaceful." Chivington did not respond. His eyes remained fixed on the valley. In the village, a man tending his horses paused and listened. He heard something faint, a distant rhythmic sound. Metal. Movement. Too far to identify. He squinted toward the ridge. Uncertain. The sun rose higher, lighting the world fully now. Every detail became clear. The lodges, the fires, the people moving peacefully, and the soldiers lined in formation. Two realities stood in plain sight. A child tugged on her mother's dress and pointed toward the ridge. "What is that?" she asked softly. Her mother looked too, squinting, trying to make out the shapes. But she reassured her child. "There is nothing to fear." On the ridge, the energy shifted. A hush fell over the soldiers. The atmosphere thickened. Anticipation, uncertainty, inevitable momentum. They waited for one final command. A Cheyenne elder gazed toward the rising sun, feeling a strange heaviness in the air. He whispered a quiet prayer, not out of fear, but out of instinct. Sometimes, the land speaks in ways only the wise can hear. Black Kettle walked back toward the flags, straightening them once more. The fabric fluttered gently in the breeze. Symbols of peace, symbols of hope, symbols he believed still held power. On the ridge, Chivington raised himself in the saddle. He moved slowly, deliberately, signaling that the time for hesitation was ending. The soldiers adjusted their positions. A moment stretched thin. Below, the people of Sand Creek remained immersed in their morning rituals, unaware that they stood at the edge of a moment history would remember for generations. Between ridge and valley lay only a breath of quiet air, one final fragment of peace, before decisions made far away arrived at the doorstep of a village that believed itself protected. The last seconds of stillness were slipping away. The sun continued its rise, washing the plains in soft gold. The light reached every corner, the ridge, the creek, the village below, binding them in the same morning warmth. But the feeling beneath that light was beginning to shift. A young Cheyenne boy paused mid-play, holding a small carved stick in his hand. He looked toward the ridge again. This time he sensed the shapes were not ordinary travelers. Still, he said nothing. Children often feel things before they understand them. On the ridge, a murmur passed through the soldiers. The final preparations were nearly complete. Horses steadied themselves. Men adjusted straps and equipment. A quiet ripple of readiness spread through the line, like a wave rolling across still water. In the village, a woman lifted her head from the fire and noticed the same movement on the ridge. Her brow tightened for a moment, but only briefly. The flags were flying. The promises had been given. There was no reason to assume danger. Two young warriors stood near the edge of the village, talking softly, glancing occasionally toward the ridge. They felt a strange unease. Not fear, but curiosity mixed with instinct. Warriors noticed details. Others overlook. Black Kettle walked toward the creek again, viewing the land with calm eyes. He saw the shimmer on the water, the glow of sunlight on the lodges. The familiar beauty of the morning promised to be peaceful. He had no thought of danger. On the ridge, Chivington scanned the scene below. With a narrowed gaze, he saw the families, the fires, the flags, but his interpretation was fixed long before this morning. A lieutenant rode forward again, this time with more urgency. "Sir, they're not preparing for anything. They're just living." Chivington's jaw tightened, but he did not answer. Orders from elsewhere outweighed the reality he saw. Back in the village, the gentle sounds of morning continued. Children laughing, fires crackling, voices rising softly. Nothing matched the tension on the ridge. Two worlds, two interpretations, stood only minutes apart. A dog trotted toward the outskirts of the camp, ears up, nose lifting to the wind. It stopped suddenly, sensing what its human companions could not. Instinct spoke, where warnings had failed. A group of soldiers on the ridge began shifting impatiently. Some clenched their jaws. Others looked away, their thoughts hidden behind stoic faces. Not all believed in the decision being made, but the momentum was greater than their doubt. Below, a Cheyenne elder tightened his cloak and walked a short distance from his lodge. He sensed unease, not from sight, not from sound, but from the stillness in the air. He whispered a quiet reminder to himself. "The land speaks. Listen." Black Kettle returned toward the flags, the symbols he trusted above all. Their colors fluttered lightly in the breeze. He believed, as long as those flags flew, his people were protected. On the ridge, Chivington's horse shifted beneath him. The colonel straightened, took a slow breath, and looked down at the peaceful camp. The moment was approaching its threshold. The villagers, still unaware, continued preparing for daybreak. A woman fed her small child. A father tied down a lodge covering. A boy splashed water on his face at the creek. Life moved forward, beautiful and vulnerable. The soldiers were now silent. A stillness overtook the ridge. Not calm, but anticipation. Even the wind seemed to step back, as if the land itself refused to take part in what was coming. Two young Cheyenne men walked together toward the center of the village, talking softly about chores for the day. One of them paused, glanced again at the ridge, and felt the faintest unease. He could not explain it. Chivington lifted his arm slightly. Not yet a command, but close. The soldiers leaned forward in their saddles, their bodies aligning instinctively to the signal they expected. A final breath separated choice from consequence. Black Kettle turned again toward the morning sky, watching it brighten into soft gold. He breathed slowly, feeling gratitude for another day. He had no idea how profoundly this moment was about to change. Between the ridge and village, the plains stood quiet, holding the final seconds of peace. Before history shifted, two truths, two beliefs, two interpretations of safety and danger were about to collide, and nothing would ever be the same. The light of morning settled fully over the plains now, brightening the valley, revealing every lodge, every figure, every quiet detail of the peaceful village below. But what the light revealed did not change the course already in motion. Chivington scanned the scene once more. He saw no warriors preparing, no signs of threat, no movement that suggested danger. Yet his beliefs, shaped long before this morning, held more weight than the reality before him. On the ridge, soldiers adjusted their saddles, their armor, their reins. They breathed in the cold air, as if steadying themselves. For a moment, none of them could fully grasp. Some hearts were steady, some were trembling, but all waited. Below, the village moved with gentle rhythm. A mother wrapped a blanket around her child. A young man carried firewood. An elder prepared herbs for the day's use. Nothing suggested danger. Nothing broke the ordinary pattern of life. Black Kettle walked again toward the flags. He lifted his eyes to the sky, feeling the calm of morning settle around him. His trust remained unbroken, a trust placed in promises, spoken across tables far from here. A few villagers noticed the shapes on the ridge more clearly now. They saw horses. They saw men. But they also saw the flags. Symbols meant to prevent confusion. Symbols meant to protect their lives. Belief in that protection kept fear from rising. On the ridge, a young soldier swallowed hard and whispered to the man beside him, "They look peaceful. Are we sure this is right?" The other man did not answer. Sometimes silence is the only refuge for a troubled conscience. A hawk soared overhead again, circling between ridge and valley, its shadow gliding across the ground. Nature witnessed what no human yet understood, the weight of a moment, about to reshape generations. Down at the creek, children splashed water onto their faces, laughing at the sudden cold. Their joy carried across the valley, a sound that drifted upward, toward ears too tense to hear it clearly. Black Kettle knelt briefly beside the water, cupping it in his hands. He let it fall slowly back into the creek, watching the ripples spread outward. Ripples, like choices, moved farther than expected. On the ridge, Chivington sat motionless, his posture rigid. His eyes did not soften, even when faced with the calmness below. He moved his hand slightly, a signal, small but unmistakable. The soldiers straightened. A Cheyenne elder in the village paused mid-step. He sensed a strange tension, perhaps from instinct, perhaps from the quiet stillness in the air. He looked toward the ridge and frowned. Something was wrong, but he could not yet shape the thought in words. The wind shifted again, brushing past the ridge and flowing into the valley. It carried the faint scent of metal and leather, a scent foreign to a morning like this. A young Cheyenne mother felt a sudden chill. She hugged her child closer, without knowing why. Sometimes intuition speaks long before the mind understands. Meanwhile, on the ridge, horses stamped nervously, hooves kicking at frozen ground. Their unease echoed the tension, tightening across the formation. Even animals sensed that the world was about to change. Chivington leaned forward in the saddle, his eyes narrowed, fixed on the village below. The soldiers braced themselves, anticipating the final motion they had been waiting for. A breath hung suspended between command and consequence. Below, the village still moved peacefully, fires warming, voices rising, the morning unfolding gently, as it always had. They remained unaware that the moment between peace and disaster was now measured in heartbeats. A young Cheyenne boy tugged on his father's arm, pointing toward the ridge. "There are many riders," he whispered. His father looked, but still believed the flags protected them from misunderstanding. In the valley, the sunlight spread wider, casting long shadows that met the shadows descending from the ridge. Two shadows, two worlds, drawing closer together. The land held its breath. The ridge tightened. The village glowed in the warmth of the rising sun. Between them stood the final sliver of peace, A fragile silence, seconds away from breaking. History had reached the edge. The morning sun now fully illuminated the plains, casting clarity across every detail. The quiet village below, the tense line on the ridge, and the vast stretch of land between them, holding the weight of an unspoken moment. A Cheyenne elder stepped out from his lodge and frowned softly. He sensed a heaviness in the air, a feeling without shape, without voice, yet impossible to ignore. The land felt different. A light breeze crossed the valley, carrying with it the distant sound of horses shifting, metal brushing against leather, and muffled breaths of men waiting. The villagers heard only faint whispers, too soft to understand, too distant to alarm. Black Kettle stood near the flags again, his wife at his side. She touched his arm gently, asking if everything was all right. He nodded. How could he imagine otherwise? The flags promised protection. On the ridge, soldiers leaned slightly forward, their bodies aligning with anticipation, their eyes fixed on the village, each man interpreting the scene through the lens of rumors they had heard. Rumors can be louder than truth. A Cheyenne woman stepped away from her fire and shaded her eyes with her hand. This time, she studied the ridge more carefully. The shapes were clearer. There were many riders, more than she expected. Her heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from uncertainty. Two young warriors walked toward the edge of the village, curiosity guiding their steps. They did not carry weapons. They had been told they did not need them. Peace had been agreed upon, but instinct pulled them forward. On the ridge, a sergeant whispered to Chivington. His voice is tight. "Sir, are we waiting for confirmation?" Chivington did not look at him. He simply held his posture, eyes fixed, intent unshaken. Down in the village, a young boy laughed as he chased a dog through the rising light. The dog barked playfully, tail wagging, before suddenly stopping, ears raised, body stiff. Animals listen to the world in ways humans forget. Black Kettle looked toward the ridge again. This time, he focused longer. Something felt different, like a shift in the balance of the plains. He placed a hand on his chest, taking a slow, controlled breath. Still, he trusted the flags. Chivington's horse turned its head uneasily. The colonel steadied it, tightening the reins. A cold wind swept across the ridge, carrying dust and a sense of finality. A moment stretched thin, fragile as a thread. At the edge of the village, the two young warriors stopped walking. They studied the ridge silently, their expressions turning uncertain. They did not move any closer. Something held them back, an instinct as old as their people. A mother pulled her child closer, feeling a strange unease in the air. Though she could not name it, the child looked up at her, confused by the sudden embrace, but comforted all the same. On the ridge, the soldiers' tension thickened. The air around them felt heavy, a weight pressing down, urging them toward an irreversible moment. Their breaths came slow and deep. Even silence can feel loud. The sunlight reached its full height, casting brilliant light over the fields. For a brief, breathtaking moment, the entire valley glowed. Peaceful, simple, whole. Black Kettle stood firmly beneath the flags, watching the ridge with steady eyes. He had lived through hardship before, but always believed in the power of agreements. He believed in the promise made to him and his people. Chivington shifted his weight. His soldiers followed the motion instinctively, horses stepping, gear clinking, breath fogging in the cold air. This was the last moment. Before command, the villagers, still unaware, continued their morning tasks. The rhythm of life unchanged. Their trust in the promise of peace remained unbroken. The ridge darkened with final intent. The world seemed to pause, as though the plains themselves recognized the importance of the moment. This quiet, this breath, was the last of its kind. Between the ridge and the village, the air felt charged, silent, heavy with the weight of decisions made far away. The moment was here, the fragile edge between peace and its unraveling. History hovered in the balance,